I had a patient who kept telling me the same thing. One week he'd go to the gym 4 times, clean his apartment, meal prep, answer every email, and finally feel like he had his life together. The next week, he could barely do laundry. He wasn't asking me why he had bad days. Everyone has bad days. He was asking something much harder. Where does that version of me keep going? And if you have ADHD, you've probably asked yourself that exact same question. Not, why can't I do this? But, why can I do it sometimes? Because eventually you realize something. Starting isn't the problem. Staying focused isn't the problem. But sustaining consistency is. And over the years, I've realized something. Intensity and consistency are not the same thing. Most ADHD advice focuses on getting started. Some focuses on staying focused. But almost nobody talks about how to keep the wheels on long enough to actually build something. And who am I to tell you that your heroic effort might actually be the problem? My name is Dr. Salman Aziz Mirza, triple board certified in adult psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and addiction medicine. And despite filming several of these videos in a single burst of productivity, it still took me weeks to send over the editing instructions. Oops. Here's the thing that makes this pattern so painful. It's not that you don't know what you're capable of. You do. You've had the good weeks, the productive weeks, the weeks where everything clicks. And that's exactly what makes the crash so brutal. Because you can't tell yourself that you aren't capable. You've already proven that you are. In fact, one of the hardest parts of ADHD isn't failing, it's succeeding just enough to know what you're capable of. Because now every bad day comes with a comparison. Not to some unrealistic ideal, to last Tuesday, the version of you that was genuinely crushing it. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. But here's the weird part. The thing most people point to as proof that they're capable might actually be the thing keeping them trapped. Most people assume the problem is discipline, or motivation, or effort. I've found that that's usually not the problem at all. The problem is that ADHD doesn't just affect attention. It affects how effort gets regulated over time. ADHD tends to come in waves, bursts, surges, and then the lull. Which means the real question isn't, can I focus? It's, can I pace? Think about it this way. You're built like a sprinter, but life keeps asking you to run a marathon. And if a sprinter tries to run a marathon at sprint pace, they don't just slow down, they collapse. Then they spend the next 3 days wondering what happened. That's not weakness, that's physiology. And it's why intensity and consistency aren't the same thing. Most people assume their best week is the blueprint. So every time they feel good, they push harder. They try to get ahead, to try to make the most of the momentum while it's there. But what if the thing you're trying hardest to recreate is the thing causing the collapse? Because once you understand that, the next piece starts to make a lot more sense. So if intensity isn't the same thing as consistency, what actually causes the crash? For a lot of people, the answer is something that feels like a superpower. Hyperfocus. Most people see hyperfocus as proof they finally figured it out. I don't. In fact, I think that hyperfocus causes far more problems than people realize. Here's why. Hyperfocus isn't free energy. It's a high interest loan. Hyperfocus solves today's problem by borrowing energy from tomorrow. And once you see it that way, a lot of things start making sense. A deadline is approaching, the urgency kicks in, the dopamine shows up, and suddenly you're locked in. You produce 3 days of work in a single night. It feels incredible, like you finally cracked the code. Then, The next 2 days arrive and you can barely function. Nothing broke, but the bill came due. The same thing happens outside of work. Maybe you spend an entire weekend getting your life together, cleaning, organizing, catching up on everything you've been putting off. By Sunday night, everything looks better. But by Monday morning, well, you feel like you've been hit by a truck. The apartment got reset, but you didn't. How about writers, artists, entrepreneurs? They know this feeling too. A 12-hour burst of creativity can produce amazing work, but it can also leave you staring at a screen the next day, unable to make even simple decisions. Not because you're lazy, because you spent tomorrow's energy yesterday. Medication is worth mentioning briefly here. It can absolutely help with starting and staying on task, but it doesn't automatically teach pacing. In fact, one of the less discussed traps is that some people finally gain access to sustained focus and immediately use it to push even harder, which just creates a bigger crash later. And that's where the real damage starts. Because eventually the problem stops being the crash itself. The problem is that you stop trusting yourself. A productive week stops feeling exciting. It starts feeling suspicious. You've seen this movie before. You know how it ends. Good week, crash, shame, overcompensation, crash again. And after enough repetitions, every burst of productivity becomes an attempt to make up for the last collapse, which means the next crash is already being built before you've recovered from the current one. So if more effort isn't the answer, what is? Here's where most advice falls apart. People hear stop overworking yourself and immediately translate it into do less. That's not the solution. The solution is changing the question. After nearly a decade of practice, I started noticing something. The people who improved weren't the people having the best days. They were the people having better bad days. And once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. And that's where the consistency floor comes in. Most people with ADHD spend years asking, how do I get back to my best self? That's the wrong question. A better question is, what's my worst day that still counts? That's your consistency floor. The minimum version of a day that still means that you showed up. And for most people, it's much lower than they think. On a 20% day, maybe that means taking your medication, going for a 10-minute walk, sending one important email, taking a shower. And that's it. If those things happen, the day counts. You didn't get a 0. You held the floor. And some days, that's the win. Because ADHD tends to pull people into all or nothing thinking. When success means full effort, anything less feels like a failure. So the day gets abandoned, and then the week, then the habit. The consistency floor breaks that pattern because success is no longer measured by how high you climbed. It's measured by whether you showed up. There's one other piece to this. I call it energy budgeting. Most people want to spend every ounce of energy on the good days. Push harder, get ahead, ride the momentum while it's there. But if you spend 100% today, tomorrow starts with the bill. Every time. Which means one of the most important skills for sustaining progress is learning to stop before you're forced to, leaving 10% in the tank. And even when you feel like you could keep going. Because recovery isn't the opposite of productivity. It's what makes productivity possible. And this is where the real shift happens. Most people with ADHD spend years trying to become their best self. I think that's the wrong goal. Your best self only shows up occasionally. The person who actually changes their life is the version that shows up consistently. The version that keeps promises on a 20% day. The version that can be counted on. That's the person you're trying to build. Not the most productive version of yourself, the most reliable version. That patient I mentioned earlier, he didn't suddenly become more motivated. He was already trying incredibly hard. What changed for him was the benchmark. He he stopped measuring himself against his best days and started measuring himself against his minimum. Once he did that, the shame cycle finally started to loosen its grip. So if you've spent years wondering where that productive version of you keeps disappearing to, well, I hope this video gave you a different way to think about it. Maybe the problem was never that you weren't capable. Maybe you were measuring yourself against a version of yourself that was never meant to show up every day. And when you do that long enough, you stop trusting yourself. That's why I think the consistency floor matters so much. Not because it's a productivity tool, because it's a self-trust tool. Every time you keep the floor, you're proving to yourself that progress doesn't require a perfect day. If you take one thing away from this video, let it be this. The goal isn't becoming someone who performs at 100% every day. The goal is becoming someone that you can count on. So, here's your homework. Write down 3 things that would make a 20% day still count. That's your consistency floor. And it might do more for your life than another heroic week ever could. Because everyone falls off track eventually. Everyone. The real question isn't whether you'll stumble, it's what happens next. How do you keep one bad day from becoming a bad week? How do you keep a bad week from becoming a bad month? And that's what we're talking about in the next episode. Stabilize. Because the people who succeed aren't the people who never fall off track. They're the people who know how to recover. So make sure that you're subscribed to the playlist down below. And until next time, be safe and be well.